So yes, as Pranamati said, my name is Shantigarbha, and I've been involved in the Triratna Buddhist community for the last 26 years. I've been ordained for the last 14 or 15. And in the last 7 or 8 years, I've been teaching non-violent communication. So this is a communication and conflict resolution process. And empathy and honesty are the two key aspects of this process. So through non-violent communication, I've come to understand more deeply an aspect of the Buddhist tradition, the altruistic or compassionate aspect of the Buddhist tradition. In particular, the Bodhichitta Teachings, made popular by Shantigarbha in his poem, the Bodhicharyavatara. And something he says is that human beings they're always trying to enrich their lives. They're always seeking their highest good. Okay? All beings want their highest good. And I understood this in theory, but I didn't really know how to embody it in my life. And then when I started hearing about nonviolent communication, I got some kind of clue. So Marshall Rosenberg, I think this was in 2002, I heard him speaking in London. And he said, whatever human beings do, they're trying to fulfill their needs. Needs are resources life requires to sustain itself. They include needs such as air, water, and so on, physical needs. They include psychological needs such as understanding, support, honesty, and so on. And they include spiritual needs such as meaning, beauty, wholeness, those more kind of spiritual needs. So defining needs in this way, all human beings have the same needs. We just differ in how we go about trying to meet those needs. Differ from person to person, temperament to temperament, culture to culture. And as I reflected on what he was saying, the image of a Bodhisattva came to mind. Now, a Bodhisattva is the ideal Buddhist who practices for the benefit of all beings. But the particular the particular image I had was of Marshall Rosenberg relating to all human beings as beings who were continually trying to enrich their lives. Okay? So I began to get a glimpse about how I might enrich my life in ways that would also enrich the lives of the people around me. So before this, I had this kind of rather black and white view of enriching lives. It was either me, just me, enriching my life and sod the rest of you, or it was give everything to everybody else and nothing left for me. So I had this kind of rather black and white view before this point. But then I got some kind of glimpse when I heard him talking. I got some kind of glimpse that actually, well, what about, could it be, how could I enrich my life in ways that would also enrich the lives of the people around me? How could I honour my well-being in ways which also honoured and dignified the well-being of the welfare of people and animals around me? So to explore this kind of vision, I recently wrote a book on empathy, on the topic of empathy, and relating it to the Buddhist tradition, or relating it to some modern psychological studies, some modern neuroscientific studies. And I wanted just to share something of what I've been exploring. I think I must have been doing this for three years or something like that. I think I started about 4 years ago trying to write something, and in the end I ended up with empathy. So I'll be addressing this topic of empathy by asking, what is it? Why empathy? And how? So how to develop empathy? How does empathy develop? So first of all, what is empathy? So to explore this, we'll go back to the Buddha, and just after his enlightenment, so the Buddha had this amazing, transformative, insightful experience that's apparently completely transformed him, almost into another kind of being. And then he was faced with a dilemma. Almost immediately afterwards, he was faced with a dilemma. Reflecting on the truth that he'd discovered, he realized that it was going to be very difficult to communicate to other people. It was going to be very, very difficult to communicate this truth. In fact, he looked around and he thought, well, the people around me, they're so kind of caught up in the stories that they tell themselves about themselves and about their place in the world, that even if he did share what he discovered, they just wouldn't understand. So he was inclined not to share what he discovered. He was inclined just to keep it to himself, really. As he said at the time, if I were to teach the Dharma, that is the truth, others would not understand me, and that would be wearying and troublesome for me. So there you see a very human aspect of the Buddha. Straight after his enlightenment, he thought, it's just going to be a hassle, you know. People, you know, it's like they won't get it, you know. But fortunately, the story didn't end there. According to the account, a divine being known as Brahma Sahampati, the Lord of the 1,000 worlds, came to the Buddha. And we can imagine the Buddha sitting under the Bodhi tree, sitting very peacefully under the Bodhi tree, and Brahma Sahampati coming like a great golden light descending from the sky. This was how the tradition of the time thought of the gods. And then Brahma Sahampati takes some kind of more sort of human form, because then he's bowing down to the Buddha and saluting the Buddha. And he begs the Buddha to teach. He says, "Let the Blessed One teach the Dharma. Beings in the world haven't heard the truth yet. There are those who aren't fulfilling their potential because of this." And he said, "Open the doors to the deathless. There are those who will understand." So the Buddha listened to Brahma Sahampati and he reassessed the situation. And he said later, "Out of compassion for beings, I surveyed the world with the eye of a Buddha." So this is some kind of eye of insight which opens at enlightenment. And he saw that indeed there were some beings who had but little dust on their eyes, so they had relatively clear vision, and that they could learn and understand the truth that he discovered. And it struck him that beings were like a lotus pond of blue and red and white lotus flowers. So if you can imagine, just imagine this for yourselves. He sort of saw the world, and he saw beings in the world as a pond of lotuses, blue and white and red lotuses. So all of these lotuses were growing out of the mud. They all began in the mud at the bottom of the pond, in the same mud. Some were living and thriving in the water without rising out of it. Some rested on the surface, and some had risen out of the water. So the newly enlightened Buddha saw human beings, or saw beings in general, in this kind of way, as having some kind of spiritual potential. He saw them in terms of their spiritual potential. So we could say that each one of us is reaching up for something, is reaching out for something, some different way of being. Perhaps a sense of wholeness, perhaps a sense of meaning, perhaps a sense of freedom. So with this vision, the Buddha was moved to communicate what he discovered. And he said, "Open for them," that is beings, "open for them are the doors of the deathless. Let those with ears now show their faith," or develop their faith. So Brahma Sahampati, this great golden light, was satisfied with this, and he bowed to the Buddha and he left. So we have this vision right at the start of Buddhism, so to speak, immediately after the Buddha's enlightenment, this kind of what I might call empathic vision of beings, of beings, human beings, other kinds of beings, in terms of their potential, in terms of their potential for growing, their potential for growth. So for me, this is really the starting point of the empathic Buddha, so to speak, or how do we talk about the Buddha in the context of empathy, or empathy in the context of the Buddha? At first glance, there doesn't appear to be a specific term for empathy in the Buddhist texts. However, we do have this passage, a a traditional description of the Buddha from the Anguttara Nikaya. So it's repeated in many, many different places, this description. It says, monks, there is one person who was born and comes into the world for the welfare and happiness of the people, out of compassion, and the word is anukampa, for the world, for the benefit, welfare and happiness of gods and human beings. Who is that person? The Tathagata, that is, the person who's thus gone, one of the Buddha's names, the worthy one, the fully and completely enlightened one. So we have this passage, it says, out of compassion. The Buddha came into the world out of compassion. And the word is anukampa. And the word anukampa is not the usual word for compassion. The usual word is karuna. But the word anukampa means something like trembling with, okay, or resonating with. So it's the aspect of compassion which is resonating with beings, or even trembling with beings. So actually having some bodily sense of other beings and their experience, sort of kind of, yeah, sensing or intuiting the experience of other beings. So this is, anukampa is as close as we can get to what we mean by empathy at the level of enlightenment. So empathy is the anukampa aspect of enlightenment, the trembling with or the resonating with aspect of enlightenment. It's about meeting people where they are rather than where we would like them to be. So usually I want to meet people where I'd like them to. I'd like them to be here, or I'd like them to be here, or I'd like them to be doing this. Empathy is about meeting them wherever they are. So it's a going out towards other people. In terms of mindfulness, empathy is a kind of external mindfulness, where we can be aware of our body, our feelings, our thoughts, and so forth. Well, mindfulness is an awareness of others, awareness of other beings. And in terms of the Brahma Viharas, for those who are familiar with those, so loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity, empathy is the reflective aspect of the Brahma Viharas, of these four qualities. So they all contain it, or it's an aspect of all four of them. In a sentence, empathy is a compassionate understanding of others' experience. So empathy is a compassionate understanding of others' experience. So I'll just pause there. So empathy is not the same as agreeing with somebody. Okay? Now sometimes people are afraid to try to understand what's going on for the people around them, particularly when they're in conflict with them, because they're kind of afraid that it'll be taken as agreeing with the other person. So empathy is not the same. Empathy is over here, agreeing's over here. You don't ever have to agree with anybody ever again in order to be totally empathic, totally in tune. You can get that connection. Doesn't mean you agree with the worldview, doesn't mean you agree with the way they're going about doing what they're doing. Two things for me are different and separate. And I'm going to give an example a bit later on, but I'll just mention here. So, for instance, somebody who perhaps you read about in the news described as a suicide bomber. So you might think, well, how could you empathize with a person like that? Well, perhaps you could understand their rage or their desperation to be understood, to find some dignity in life, or to protect their community. That doesn't mean you agree with how they're going about doing that, or the worldview which would lead them to act in such a way. Yeah? So understanding is not the same as agreeing. And I'll say more about that a bit later. So empathy is one of a number of choices we have in order to embody a compassionate intention. It's not the only one. And to illustrate this, I'd like to give an example of, let's say there's somebody, you're living with somebody and they're drinking in a way, they're drinking alcohol in a way which is affecting their health and affecting their ability to do their job. So so you could choose simply just to self-empathize, just to stay connected with yourself, and that might sound something like this. Well, actually, I'm concerned for their welfare. I'd love to see them flourishing and making the most of their lives. And I don't want to add to their difficulties at the moment. So perhaps I'll just wait a few weeks and see if this sort of period of stress blows over. So that would be kind of speaking to myself. That would be sort of self-talk. You could choose to express yourself. So, well, actually, when I see the number of times, seeing the number of cans in the recycling bin, the number of cans of Guinness in the recycling bin, actually, this month, actually, I'm pretty concerned. So I wonder if we could talk about helping you to find less harmful ways of relaxing in the evenings. So you could say that to the other person. You could offer to, you could act in other ways to express some kind of compassion towards them. You could talk about actions having consequences, for instance, or you could just discuss what's going on at work at the moment. You could arrange to meet them when they come home and offer to give them a massage, or go for a walk with them, or go and watch a film or something just to help them relax. Yeah? So empathy is a choice we have. And if we choose to empathize, it might sound something like this. So just asking the person directly, well, look, are things getting on top of you at the moment at work? Are things getting difficult for you? Are you getting so wound up at work that when you come home, it's difficult to imagine relaxing without a couple of cans of Guinness? So this is the choice of empathizing with the other person. And it's a way of creating compassionate connection. It's a way of reaching out to the other person when they're not ready to reach out to you. It's a way of reaching out, meeting them where they are. And once we're connected in that kind of way, then we can look for less harmful ways of dealing with those particular behaviors that we're concerned about. So it's a choice. Empathy is a choice. It's not the only way to be compassionate. So I'd like to talk about why empathy is important, why I understand empathy is important. So my second topic. So in a word, because it creates compassionate connection. So empathy creates compassionate connection. And this was really the missing piece of kind of loving kindness and compassion that I didn't know was missing for me. But when I found it, I really knew it was the piece that I'd been missing. Compassionate connection. Compassionate, empathic connection is an immediate and practical way to embody compassion. I used to work in a psychiatric hospital for a while, and pretty much every minute there was an opportunity to connect in this kind of way with somebody. Yeah, pretty much every minute, maybe every 2 minutes if I just sat in my chair. So, you know, there are always opportunities to connect in this kind of way. And for me, the kind of the watchword is empathy before education, or connection before correction. So get the connection first before trying to fix them, or before trying to educate them, or, you know, any number of other things which I'm going to come back to a bit later on. So, compassionate connection. And then there's a whole list of other areas in which empathy seems to be very important. In fact, I was just amazed when I was writing my book about the number of areas where, particularly in the last 10 or 15 years, people have been saying empathy is really at the center of everything that we're doing, you know. So I'm just going to mention them. So, as a universal human quality that supports connection and social responsibility, as a constituent of emotional intelligence, as the basis of a moral sense, so the ethics of empathy, as an external aspect of mindfulness, as a basis for self-empathy and self-compassion, as the basis of compassion, as a healing agent in a therapeutic relationship, as a promoter of health. They've even done studies to show that actually if you treat people and then you treat some other people with empathy, then the people who are treated with empathy get better quicker than the ones who don't get the empathy. So it seems to promote health. And as a basis for mediation, reconciliation, conflict resolution, and so on. So I'm just kind of amazed by this list, because it seems to be central to all these different areas, and it's also central to the Buddhist tradition. So I want to pick up on two of these here, just two. Empathy as a basis for ethics, and empathy as a basis of compassion. So ethics and compassion. And to do this, I'm going to tell you a story from the Pali Canon, from the records of the life of the Buddha and the conversations he had. So empathy is often thought of as a kind of a Mahayana preserve, because that's where you get in the Mahayana you get all the emphasis on compassion and for the welfare of all beings. But this story comes from the Pali Canon, from the Theravadan tradition. So it's the story of King Pasenadi and Queen Malika. So they were the royals in the kingdom of Kosala, which was one of the kingdoms in which the Buddha wandered. The other one was Magadha. So at this time, the two of them, King Pasenadi and Queen Malika, were sitting on the upper terrace of the palace. Now, brick buildings were very, very rare in those days, and upper terraces were like, that meant you were a king or somebody incredibly wealthy if you could sit on the upper terrace of anything, you know. So there they are, sitting on their upper terrace, and the king asked Queen Malika, he said, "Malika, is there anyone dearer to you than yourself? Is there anyone dearer to you than yourself?" And the word for self here is just a very common and garden, ordinary, everyday word for self. It doesn't imply anything metaphysical. It just means myself or yourself and so on. And Queen Malika replies, "Your Majesty, there is no one dearer to me than myself. And you, sir, is anyone dearer to you than yourself?" And King Pasenadi replies, "No, Malika, there is no one dearer to me than myself." So they thought about this for a while. It seemed to be some kind of understanding that they'd come to, they'd reached. So King Pasenadi went down from the palace to where the Buddha was staying in Savatthi and told the Buddha the conversation. And the Buddha appreciated King Pasenadi and Queen Malika's insight, and he spoke this verse. So he kind of said this utterance, this kind of poetic utterance. He said, "Though in thought we range throughout the world, we'll nowhere find a thing more dear than self. So, since others hold the self so dear, he who loves himself should injure none." So King Pasenadi and Queen Malika, they've seen through the illusion of their specialness, their royal personage is. And they've seen that actually everybody is, well, everybody's self is dear to them. Everybody is dear to themselves. They're no different from any other being in that respect. The dearest person in the universe is, guess who? Myself. Oneself. And just as they realize that they're dearest to themselves, so they recognize that other people are dearest to themselves. And the Buddha confirms this with the verse that I just read. Nothing is dearer in the universe than oneself. This applies to everyone. And recognizing this, if you love yourself, you will also avoid harming others. You will also love others and avoid harming others. So that's the key point, that's the ethical implication. If you realize, well, actually, everybody else wants to hang on to their life. It's not just me, you know. Everybody else wants to hang on to their life. So in the same way I want to care for myself, I want to cherish myself, I'd also want to extend that to other beings who similarly cherish themselves. In a recent article called Reimagining the Buddha, there's a passage, a section on empathy. So this was written by Dharmachari Subhuti, and it's a record of a conversation with Urgyen Sangharakshita. And one of the things that comes up there is that ethics is really about feeling solidarity with all life, just as we've been looking at in the story. It is important for us to rediscover this capacity for empathy with the life around us, because it is the true basis of ethics. So it's important for us to rediscover this capacity for empathy with life around us, because it is the true basis of ethics. And in the article, Subhuti and Sangharakshita talk about the ethics of empathy. So this is a very useful phrase, the ethics of empathy. Ethics is based on connection and imagination. Ethics is not about following rules. Of course, it would be much easier if it was about following rules, because you could just do this and you could just do that and you could just be sure, actually, yes, this is I'm being ethical. But actually, ethics is not about following rules. Ethics is about feeling a connection with those whom our actions may affect. So caring about the impact of our actions. And it's about being able to imagine the impact of our actions on ourselves and others. So it's about connection and imagination. And the Dalai Lama makes a similar point in his book, Ancient Wisdom, Modern World, Ethics for a New Millennium. He says, I can't do the Tibetan accent, but he said, if we're not able to connect with others to some extent, if we cannot at least imagine the potential impact of our actions on others, then we'll have no means to discriminate between right and wrong, between what is appropriate and what is not, between harming and non-harming actions. So if we can't imagine, if we don't have some kind of connection, some kind of capacity to imagine the impact of our actions on others, we really have no way of discriminating between skillful and unskillful actions. And this point about empathy being at the heart of ethics and of moral theory is gradually becoming more popular in modern psychological theories of empathy, that place empathy at the heart of moral motivation. So that's a bit about why empathy, why is it important, why might it enrich our lives. So I'd like to say a bit about how. So how did it develop in human beings, and how can we develop it further? So as far as we know, empathy goes back as far as the first mammals, so probably about 2 million years. And it's probable that the reason it developed in mammals is that the offspring of mothers who could empathize accurately with their offspring survived in greater numbers than the offspring of mothers who didn't have a clue what was going on in their offspring. Yeah? So that ability to empathize probably made it easier for mammals to become more numerous and to become and to evolve. And recently, there's been some research in modern neuroscience. So our brains apparently create maps of intentions. So maps of our intentions, maps of the intentions of others, and also give us the ability to resonate emotionally with other people. They're probably underpinned by some things called mirror neurons, which I'm not going to go into, but there's some kind of neuron in there which supports this capacity, probably underpins this capacity to resonate with other people, to sense what's going on for other people. The good news of all this is that empathy, like mindfulness, can be developed over time. It's clear that it's a faculty, it's a capacity which can be developed over time. It's not something you're either born with or not. It's something that it's a faculty, a capacity that you can develop. So, practical tips for developing empathy. Well, it's a natural capacity, as I say, it's a faculty. It's a matter of expanding what's there already. It's a matter of expanding our natural capacity for empathy, wherever that is, to whatever extent we have that. It's not about putting myself in other people's shoes. Now, this is very, very often when people talk about empathy, this is the kind of image or the kind of the way they talk about empathy, is it's about putting yourself in somebody else's shoes. I don't suggest that. I don't encourage that. I don't train people to do that. The reason is that if somebody's upset and you ask somebody else to put themselves in their shoes, most likely this person here is going to get as distressed as the person who's upset. Okay, and that's not empathy. Distress is not empathy. Okay, so it's not about feeling what the other person is feeling. It's not about just being a sponge and sort of sponging up every feeling that's going on around you, which some people do suffer from. Yeah, it's very, very painful to be kind of it's as if you have no skin. You just kind of pick up everything. Empathy is not that. I call that identification. That's not my understanding of what empathy is. So rather than putting yourself in somebody's shoes, what I suggest is sensing what it's like for them to have their shoes on. So sensing what it's like for them to have those shoes on. Rather than going over and stepping into them, sensing what it's like, leaving them in their shoes and sensing what it's like for them to have those shoes on. And a little story to illustrate this. So, well, you may have heard this this kind of saying, which I think comes from the Native American tradition, that if you're in conflict with somebody and you really want to understand their point of view, you need to walk a mile in their moccasins. Have you heard something like this before? About, sort of walking a mile in their shoes to understand somebody? Well, what I found out is there are two good reasons for this. One is, if you've walked a mile in their moccasins, you're a mile away from them, so you can't hear them shouting. And the second one is, you've got their shoes. Okay, so that's the joke. If you don't laugh now, there won't be. I'm sorry. Maybe I'll have time at the end for something else. Anyway. Okay, so that's something about empathy and standing in people's shoes. Yeah. So, what empathy isn't? In some ways, it's easier to kind of say what it isn't. It's all in the timing, actually. It seems to be all in the timing. So imagine this situation. So you've just come back from work after a minor health issue. You've been away from work with a minor health issue. And you're telling a friend in the office or where you're working about this minor health issue. And they ask, have you tried Chinese herbs? And you say, no, you haven't. And then they say, well, it must be all those extra hours you've been putting in. I would have taken some of your caseload, but I've been very, very busy, myself. It could be, you say, yes, you have been very busy. And then they say, well, but you can't be that busy if you could afford to take the time off for something that's so minor, So you go silent for a while, and then they switch tack and they say, well, it could be worse. Last year you had that operation. At least this isn't going to, lay you up. No, that's true, you say. And then they launch into a story about last year. So, do you know, that reminds me of what a terrible year I had last year, health-wise. I must have been off work for at least 6 weeks. And then you find yourself kind of sympathizing with them, and you kind of lose connection with what you were saying and your own health. And then they say, anyway, well, you've got to keep your spirits up, There's no point in feeling down about it. And you kind of half-heartedly agree with that. And then they start asking for specifics, like, well, when did it start? Have you seen a doctor? Are you eating properly? And you start wondering why you ever called this person a friend in the first place. And somehow they pick up on this. Because they say, well, oh yes, I know how you feel. I get down like that sometimes when I'm not feeling well. And when you tell them that you've actually been to see a doctor, but he said that there was nothing wrong, they say, oh, you poor thing. You didn't go and see him, you didn't go and see that doctor, did you? That GP. He's so unsympathetic. And by this time you just want to go back to your desk and curl up behind your computer and get on with your work. But they carry on in a cheerful tone. You may be sorted out in some ways, they say, but you're a bit of a loser when it comes to looking after yourself. Never mind, if only you could get the right attitude, this could turn into a real growth experience for you. You could really learn something for this. I've got a book I could lend you about optimum nutrition. I mean, it's been my Bible. And I've had much worse stuff wrong with me than this. So, does any of this sound familiar to you? This kind of thing, yeah? Yeah? You got a friend like this? Yeah? So, I made a list. Things that may not be heard as empathy. Now, it's all in the timing. At other times, all of these things could create connection. They could be heard as empathy. However, it's a matter of timing and knowing what the other person is looking for. Maybe they're just looking for understanding. Oh, you know, you're feeling a bit down at the moment, and would you just like a period of being healthy for a while? Would you just like a bit of a break from all these health problems? You know, or are you struggling with your work at the moment? So maybe they just want some kind of understanding. And these kind of things can get in the way. That's the point. They can get in the way. So giving advice. Did I get them all in? Giving advice, explaining it away, consoling, correcting, telling a story, don't feel, oh, cheer up, you know, it's not that bad, sympathizing, colluding, pitying, oh, you poor thing, that's pitying. Investigating, like, oh, well, how many days were you off and when did it start, and so on. Evaluating, educating, and one-upping. One-upping is when you're, oh, well, that's not as bad as what I had last year, you know. So these are some things that can get in the way of empathy and can get in the way of connection. Not always. That's why I'm saying they may not be heard as empathy. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they are. Sometimes people really want suggestions or advice, and then it could be compassionate to give that. So that's something about what empathy isn't. So I'm just going to say something about what empathy is, as I understand it. So some elements of empathy. First of all, intention. So in empathy, we focus our intention on connecting compassionately. So we focus our attention on connecting, rather than trying to analyze or fix the other person, which may be a result of our own discomfort, which some discomfort we're not really comfortable with, and we try and fix the other person as a way of easing that. So we focus on the intention to connect compassionately. And we give our presence to the other person. So empathy is always silent. So rather than thinking in terms of doing something to someone, empathy is about being with the other person. About giving our attention, our presence to the other person. I heard a nice phrase for this, is like coming alongside somebody. So you don't kind of sort of shoot them down or kind of go straight up to them kind of like this. You kind of come alongside them and sort of meet them in that kind of way. In terms of focus, what we focus on with empathy, empathizing involves focusing our attention on what is alive in the other person right now. In particular, what they might be feeling and their deeper motivations, or what would enrich their life, what they're longing for, what they might need at the moment. And there's something very crucial about timing as well. So we might use words when we're empathizing, but the words aren't the empathy. Okay? Empathy is always silent. The moment of empathy is silent. It's a moment of silent connection with somebody. That moment doesn't involve words. The next moment, where you might check if you're really with that person, you might do that verbally. You might check, oh, you're a bit sad at the moment, would you like a bit of company? You might check in that way. Just to check if you're really with them. perhaps you might have a sense they might want some reassurance that you really are with them. So sense what's important to the speaker and voice your guess. Sense what's important to the person you're with and voice it. And I think I've got some examples of the kind of questions you might ask over here. So here are some very straightforward, easy empathy guesses that you can just kind of bring into a conversation when there's a pause or when you just want to check you're really with the person that you're with. So you might ask, oh, it seems as if you wish, or were you wanting a bit of company? Do you want a bit of company right now? Or are you hoping? Are you hoping for some company right now? Yeah? Or are you feeling a bit sad and you'd like a bit of company? Something like that. So these are just questions that we can just bring into the conversation. We don't have to sort of do them like a machine by rote, but just ask a question every once in a while. Just check if you're really with the person next to you. These kind of questions can bring any relationship alive, in the sense that you're really checking if you're with the other person. And most times, if you do it in a fairly relaxed and spontaneous way, most times they will deeply, deeply appreciate your interest and your attention, and you're reaching out to them. Yeah, it's the reaching out that counts. It's not the words. It's the intention to connect, which they will receive. They will get. So that's something about what I pay attention to when I'm empathizing with somebody. I pay attention to what's going on for them, what they're feeling, what they might be longing for, and so on. And these are kind of colloquial ways of asking that question. And finally, if I want to empathize with other people, I need to be connected to myself. Yeah? If I have space to connect with myself, I have space to connect with the people around me. So I don't know if you've ever tried this, when you've tried to reach out and understand what's going on for somebody else, when actually you're really upset and in conflict and maybe angry inside. Most often it's not received as empathy or understanding by the other person. They just hear that you're angry or upset. So it involves a certain amount of self-connection first. So I say sort of self-connection, self-empathy is the roots of empathizing, of the capacity to empathize with others. So to illustrate this, a few years back I was going fairly regularly to a prison in New England as part of a Buddhist outreach group, actually, from Arialoka retreat centre in New Hampshire. And we sat in the chapel, which was a high-ceilinged room with glass along one side, correction officer sitting outside, and men in brown prison uniforms came through the door and sat in this circle around in the chapel, in their 30s and 40s, one or two in their late 20s. And after some warm-up exercises, I raised the issue of what happens when we've screwed up. Now, you might think that this is a rather dangerous or bizarre thing to raise in a prison, but I was thinking, well, what's going on with these guys? I was trying to get a sense of their experience of what's important. So I said, well, what goes on when we screwed up, when we've done something we're not happy with? And I talked about mourning, and I talked about grief, and I talked about lost dreams and lost lives. And I talked a little bit about my own journey in this area. So previously, in my previous incarnations, I tried to throw out feelings of grief and mourning with the garbage. Okay, I kind of saw them as pointless, meaningless, something to be got rid of. And this had led me to several deep depressions. And then I gradually learned that grief, just as much as anything else, grief is a need, or mourning is a human need, a natural human faculty, natural part of human life. Just as much as celebrating when life goes well, mourning when needs are not met, when things are not going well, is equally important. In fact, they're two sides of the same coin. Mourning and celebration seems to be they're two sides of the same coin. And as I talked about mourning, something happened that really struck me, which was I made eye contact. Every man in that room made eye contact with me as I was talking about this, and that sense of, in prison, eye contact is a pretty rare commodity. It's usually interpreted as I'm about to beat you up. So they all made eye contact with me as I was talking, and I don't think I'll ever forget that sense of shared humanity as I was sitting there in this circle. And then they just started talking about their experience. So a man in his 40s started talking about his wife and son. Both had died since he'd been on the inside. And I wondered, well, are you sad because you would have liked to have been there to support them? And he looked at the carpet and he nodded. And later he said he'd like to remember some of the fun things they did, not just the bad things that happened, the fun things, like going to Burger King and going to the coast and going to theme parks. And a bit later on he said, actually I don't have a picture of them in my cell. So he asked he said, well, next time my brother comes, I'm going to ask my brother to bring a photo of them, just so I can put it on the shelf in my cell. And when he finished, I just thanked him for bringing that part of his life into the room. And while he was speaking, I noticed that everybody else was totally silent, just sat there totally silent, because that kind of personal material is very, very rare in that environment, because most times people are just afraid for their physical safety, and sharing something like that in a group is a really big deal. So I thanked him for bringing that part of his life into the room. On the way back from the prison, I heard from the person who was driving me, who took me there, that the prisoners' lives on the outside, their lives on the outside, were not the only ones that had been lost. My companion told me that some of the men in the group were in there because they'd acted in a way that had led to the death of other people. They'd acted intentionally, which in ways that had led to the death of other people. So lost dreams, lost lives. So I want to finish off with really pushing the limits of empathy. So could we empathize with terrorists, for instance, people who are labeled terrorists? I mean, prisoners, murderers, maybe. Could we empathize with people who strap bombs to them, explosive devices to their persons, go into crowded places with the intention of killing as many people as they can with that one device? So empathy, as I've said, is an aspect of compassion. And by its very nature, compassion extends to even to our enemies. But is it really wise to even try to empathise with, for instance, the people who were responsible for the 9/11 attacks in New York and elsewhere, or even the July 7th bombings in London? So won't it just encourage them? Won't it just kind of give them the oxygen of publicity if we empathise with these people? Won't it just encourage others to act in the same way if we extend any compassion towards them? Well, what are the human needs on both sides? Well, it seems to me if we can connect at this level, on the level of the human needs, my human needs, our human needs, and the level of people who might consider doing such actions, then we might create some kind of connection. So I imagine if, like me, you live in the UK, you'd like to be able to walk down the street and go to King's Cross without fearing for your life, for instance. You'd like to trust that people who have a disagreement with the UK government or the US government, that they will seek to address that through diplomatic means or through non-violent means, rather than through through blowing people up. Perhaps if you might be like me, you like clarity that actions have consequences, and an awareness of the consequences of strapping explosive devices to yourself. And they can be hard to imagine. It could be hard to imagine the pain and fear and grief that could lead to. So, to explore this, I'd like to just read you a section from, this is a statement by one of the people who carried out the July 7th bombings in 2007. And I'd like you to sort of test your empathy or explore, the limits of empathy for yourself as I do this. This is Mohammed Siddiq Khan. I and thousands like me are forsaking everything for what we believe. Our drive and motivation doesn't come from tangible commodities that this world has to offer. Our religion is Islam, obedience to the one true God, and following the footsteps of the final prophet messenger. Your democratically elected governments continually perpetuate atrocities against my people all over the world, and your support of them makes you directly responsible, just as I am directly responsible for protecting and avenging my Muslim brothers and sisters. Until we feel security, you will be our targets. And until you stop the bombing, gassing, imprisonment and torture of my people, we will not stop this fight. We are at war and I am a soldier. Now you too will taste the reality of this situation. So do we have the strength to empathize with this man? Does it even seem wise to do so? I've chosen this particular act because I have a personal connection with it, rather than, say, the World Trade Center. So a distant relative, my dad's cousin's sister, I think, she was in one of the tube trains on that day, on July 7th. And she was sitting next to a glass partition, and the glass partition blew into her face, and she lost the sight in one eye. She didn't lose her life. However, in that time, I was living in Cambridge. I used King's Cross pretty regularly for work and for visiting my family. So it could have been me. I guess it could have been other people here. I noticed that I really need to do some self-empathy first. Actually, I noticed a real chill going through my body while I was reading out what he said. And I really need to do some self-empathy before I can extend to another person. So, well, I want to be safe as I walk down the street. I want my relatives to be safe, free from harm, and free from the fear of harm. And I would like people who have grievances with our government, with the UK government, to resolve them by diplomatic means. In fact, by non-violent means. And I'd like the clarity and awareness of the consequences of these kind of actions in the face of others. I'd like understanding that violence begets violence. My own experience of hatred, violence and its consequences corroborates the ancient Buddhist saying, "Not by hatreds are hatreds ever pacified here in the world. They are pacified by love. This is the eternal law." So this is the kind of the inner work I need to do to kind of connect with myself. I need to do some self-empathy before I can sort of sense what's going on for him. Reconnect with myself. I also want to remember that empathizing doesn't mean agreeing. Empathizing with somebody's deeper motivations doesn't mean I agree with their worldview or the means they use to try and meet those needs. So if I empathize with Mohammed Siddiq Khan, I want to make it clear that I do so because I want to stay in touch with my own humanity. I want to be in touch with my own humanity. I want to even regain my humanity in the face of such an action. So I'm going to try. Well, I imagine that somebody labelled as a terrorist is desperate, enraged, and passionate to support the dignity and autonomy of their people, the people they identify with. I imagine that they're so desperate about those needs not being met, not being honoured, that they're willing to use violence. they're willing to take their own lives in order to do it. I imagine that they hope that their actions will be heard by governments, by the governments who, in their eyes, are making it difficult for them to meet those needs, and world attention and so on. But reading the statement more deeply, the thing that really jumps out at me is that he's longing to be understood. He deeply wants understanding for why he's taking this action. That's what sort of really strikes me about it. He wants understanding of the kind of motivation that he's acting on and the depth of it. So he sees himself as protecting a religious community that he was born into and creating some kind of balance for the pain that he's felt and that he guesses that other people have felt. So when I empathise with, in this way, I'm not agreeing with the action he chose to take. I'm not agreeing with the worldview that led to him taking that action. However, I can understand that he was trying to enrich his life. And through this understanding, I regain a sense of connection with humanity. So this brings us full circle to the Bodhichitta Teachings, which I mentioned right at the start. In order to cultivate the Bodhichitta, that is, enlightenment for the benefit of all beings, or the seed of that, Shantigarbha encourages us to imagine ourselves as another person, to put ourselves, to sense what's going on for them, to sense what's important to them. What are they thinking? What motivates them? What are they longing for? What are they dreaming of? If we can do this with someone we regard as inhuman, quotes, and label as terrorist or suicide bomber, could we do it with anyone? Indeed, with all life? So, just a brief conclusion. So, the executive summary. So, what is empathy? It's a compassionate understanding of others' experience. It's a choice we have to embody our compassionate intention. Why empathy? Why is it important? It's the basis of ethics and compassion. It creates compassionate connection. And how do we develop it? We develop it through expanding our natural empathy, our natural capacity to empathise with those around us. That's it. Thank you very much.